So this is Dying Victorian, Memento Mori, Hair, Jewelry, and Crepe from the book Death's Summer Coat by Brandy Chalice. So real quick before we really get into this article, I just want to discuss this phrase Memento Mori. What it means literally is remember that you will die or remember death. The concept of memento mori had always sort of been a thing dating back to at least the ancient Greeks, but in 1861 it blew up. Prince Albert died and Queen Victoria was very public about her bereavement, and as a consequence, death became very fashionable. So what it means in the context of this reading is that people were emulating Queen Victoria and reflecting on their own deaths through the deaths of their family members and their friends, and they were collecting these trinkets and making these trinkets from their hair and their teeth and posing with them in photographs. The headstone that's in this picture is from a cemetery in Boston that I found while I was there for an archaeology conference. I love these headstone motifs, so I took a picture of it, but it's actually kind of the perfect example of that pre-Victorian memento mori. It's an early Puritan version of it, with the skull at the top signifying mortality and the X formed by the bones underneath it signifying end, so the end of your mortality. Prior to that, there were a lot of other versions of memento mori. Like medieval era Catholic monasteries used to put up wax representations of dead bodies to encourage people to think about their spirituality instead of their material world. The whole big concept behind Buddhism is impermanence, so they encourage the same sort of thing. And then there was the Japanese. Yeah, so there that is. The Japanese Buddhist monks took this concept of death, decay, and impermanence, and from the 6th through the 19th centuries, they really amped it up. They painted these graphically detailed watercolors of decaying corpses called kusozu. They originally would hang them in monasteries in an effort to curb the sensual desires of the monks, reminding them that these women that they may be lusting after would one day decompose and look like this, and the attraction to the human shell was therefore pointless. So there's a ton of these, but this is one of the best preserved ones from the 19th century called Body of a Courtesan in 9 Stages. It lives at the British Museum because, of course, it does. The woman here is a courtesan, a sex worker, signifying physical pleasure, and it shows the 9 stages of her decay until she is eventually nothing but bones. This is a reminder of the end of all things, and that she, like everyone else, is nothing but bones underneath a decomposing meat bag. On that uplifting note, we are going to fast forward to the Victorian era. It's around this time that the middle class starts to form and the Western world enters the state of industrialism, science, and rationality. The upper class kind of freaked out over the fact that there was this new middle class and there wasn't as much separation between them and the poor. So in the spirit of this newfound industrialism and rationality, they did what any rational rich person does when they feel threatened, and they found new ways to show how much better they were than anyone else. One of those ways was postmortem photography. So this postmortem photography was a really big deal. Photography was still a pretty new technology, and they were using what was called a daguerreotype. And essentially what that was a polished silver plate. The individual had to hold their position for 60 to 90 seconds for the image to completely transfer to the silver plate. Then a ton of mercury was poured over it until an image appeared, and then the image was preserved with a gold chloride. So obviously it was a really lengthy process. That was a lot of work for the photographer, and the technology was new, so it was expensive. Only those that were well off could afford to do it, and even in those cases, photography was still so expensive that sometimes a post-mortem photo was the only one a family ever had. I think these are really interesting to look at because, well, I'm morbid like that, but also because you can tell exactly who's dead. Because the image took so long to transfer, live people were much harder to develop and focus, so they tend to appear slightly blurry. Dead people, on the other hand, are way better at staying still, so they are the only ones that are in focus. A lot of the time, the family gave the photographers really complex directions, and there was a lot of really specialized furniture and equipment that was used in order to have the deceased individual look as lifelike as possible. The point of the photograph wasn't necessarily to remember the person in death, but it comes across more like a public denial of the death. One of the quotes in the reading I like that explained this was, "Let nature imitate what nature made." In the spirit, pun intended, of that denial, there was a second kind of postmortem photography that was created around the same time called spirit photography. Essentially, the photographers would make these double exposure photographs where the subject of the photo was in the forefront and bold, and then a faint shadow of the deceased was placed in their proximity. Despite all of the science and rationalization that was occurring, photography was really new, and the average person didn't know how to manipulate photos or even necessarily know that the photos could be manipulated. So they truly believed that these spirit photographers had a way of capturing the essence of the deceased. This became insanely popular because it was once again that denial of death. It gave the impression that the dead were still among us, exactly as they were in life, and that they were now watching the living. Cemeteries were also a new way for the upper class to show how much better they were than everyone else. Graveyards had been packed over the centuries, and they weren't really picky about who they took in to be buried. This coupled with the fact that they were becoming more and more crowded because the population was dying at a faster rate due to the notoriously dirty living conditions of the Victorian era, meant that people were being literally buried on top of each other in shallow graves, regardless of their social class. The reading made a reference to England having problems with that because new buildings were being built on top of these shallow graves, but they're actually having a huge problem with that right now on the east coast of the US too. There are buildings that are at risk of collapsing because they were built on these super shallow graves, and there are development companies that are finding evidence of graves and hiring teams of archaeologists to come out. They'll say, oh, we found about 18 graves here. We think that's it. Can you come double check? And these teams, in one instance in Philadelphia, found over 1,500 individuals buried in the same area that there were only supposed to be 18. Yeah, that was because there were some spots that were missed, but it's also just because of the massive amounts of individuals that are sharing the same grave. Cemeteries, on the other hand, operated on a sliding scale, and if you had more money than everyone, you could be buried better than everyone. And as a bonus, your relatives didn't have to mingle with the poor when they came to pay their respects. Outside of the overcrowding graveyards, cemeteries were also appealing because individuals on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder were seen as dirty and a source of contagion, which was not exactly what others wanted to be hanging around with. This is a sociology class, we should probably discuss the effects that this had on society. So, except for very few instances, social change starts with the rich. It always has, it always will, and it's because the rich don't have the financial constraints that lower classes do and can afford to do more. As such, they were able to turn this dark concept of death into something of beauty. Graveyards were somber and dark, but cemeteries were these huge, lush green parks that could be picnicked in. And because you don't want to eat your lunch where there are reminders of the moldering bodies beneath you, they changed the lingo in the entire way that death was talked about. So it wasn't moldering anymore, it was eternally slumbering, and they weren't dead, their spirit had departed. They came up with a lot of euphemisms for the unpleasantries of death to reframe how it was thought about and really made it sort of reveling in it acceptable. Anyway, let's talk about fashion. So Queen Victoria was mourning the loss of her husband in a very public way, and it made public grieving very acceptable. She started her mourning period in December of 1861 after her husband succumbed to illness, and continued this mourning period until her own death in 1901. This in turn had a huge effect on widowed women and essentially turned them into living memorials for their husbands. Husbands and parents had mourning periods for the loss of their wives or children, but it was nothing like the extended grieving period expected of women who had lost their husbands. Mourning periods generally lasted about 2 years, with a half mourning period lasting an additional 2 years after that. So the first year after their husband's passing, widows wore black crepe, which was this scratchy, stiff material that didn't reflect any light. In the second year, they still wore black crepe, but they could add white cuffs or collars. Following that, they could wear a black fabric that reflected light and had a sheen, and then in their half mourning, they could move on to wearing gray or purple fabrics in addition to their black. Of course, if you have a certain aesthetic to maintain, you have to have the accessories to go with it. So the Victorians really took to things in what the reading refers to as secular relics. There was a belief that memories could leave the human body and attach themselves to objects, so someone's personal object would absorb their memories and their traumas. This was, again, that Victorian denial of death and was a representation of their desire for their loved one to continue living on through their objects. And what's more personal to someone than their body parts? Hair jewelry became a really big thing. It became very fashionable. Locks of the deceased hair would be put into a glass compartment that was then worn on a chain as a pendant. There were also smaller glass compartments that could be fastened into bracelets, and jewelers made specialized rings that had a glass compartment that hair could be curled into, or they made gold jewelry with a compartment in the back that hair could be placed into, like a ring or a stud. Another thing that they would do was they took locks of hair and they braided them into ropes, and they made things like fob chains for men to hold their pocket watches. This sounds like a lovely way to memorialize and display the identity of the deceased, but in fact, it was actually a way to memorialize the grief that someone was experiencing. It allowed others to identify the grieving individual, and a quote from the reading, "These relics worked as traces of life and body completed and disappeared. In this sense, something like lost words, but they also serve as frames or fragments from the moments of loss." As an added bonus, this outward expression of grief functioned as a way for women to ward off unwanted advances from men. While wearing rings made of a dead person's teeth or lockets made of their hair may sound unappealing today, the space that they created for grief probably isn't. These things allowed passers-by to identify grieving individuals. And in today's world, it's constantly moving at a fast pace, and it doesn't slow down for anyone or anything. But when there are those defined sets of steps that a culture in its entirety recognizes, it changes how those things are approached. There were levels of grieving that everyone in the Victorian era recognized and just unanimously respected. They understood that each new level was a rite of passage, and holding on to this sort of ritual and respecting and acknowledging the grief was a way of processing the emotions that came along with each stage of the grieving. So if it was so helpful and it was so great, what happened to it, right? Well, the answer is no one's really 100% sure. The Victorian era was a time of new science and rationality, but it's still really heavy with magic as an explanation for things that were unexplainable. So as our society moved deeper into science and new sciences started to emerge, like psychology, we were suddenly able to explain these phenomena, and the belief in spirits and seances kind of fell by the wayside. Life also picked up. There were new ways of travel and production that were being developed, and people didn't have as much time to devote to their grief, mourning, or even recording deaths. Family members moved further and further away as the country expanded, and because of this lack of time and this lack of family, funeral parlors were created to take care of the bodies instead of the families keeping them in their homes. So it could be all of these reasons, it could be none of these reasons, it could be a combination of some of these reasons, but the bottom line is it started rapidly and it ended almost just as quickly. All of a sudden, things that held status and value became meaningless, and that quick end had a huge hand in shaping how we view and approach death today. It took death from the celebrated communal event to a private, uncomfortable circumstance because we eliminated those rituals. Which brings me to our discussion questions. So the first one I have for you is, for these practices to start, we had to take something that was a little taboo and then glorify it. We obviously don't do that with death now, at least not to the same extent. But is there something that was maybe once considered taboo that we have taken to glorifying and appreciating as an aesthetic now? And second, I spent a lot of time talking about different ways people were remembered. So how do you want to be remembered? And would you bring back any of these death practices in that way you want to be remembered?